Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming and games through a feminist lens. Today, I'm your host, Alex, and I'm joined by my friends Jem and Matt. Before we get started, if you want to support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem for some exclusive content. Or you can send us a one-off donation via PayPal to our email address, wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com. Today we're going to be rounding off our series of episodes on horror in gaming, spooking the system, you might say, and we're going to be looking particularly at the tropes around disability and race in horror in the general genre, whether it be gaming or films, largely gaming, since we are a gaming podcast. So we did touch on some aspects of this briefly in our previous two episodes. And you can tell it's a massive topic because this had originally intended to be one episode and has turned into a trilogy. So there's plenty to discuss.
Like all the best stories.
Indeed, yes. Always a good trilogy.
Like Fast and Furious.
So, starting off then with the topic of disability within horror, it's quite often used as a symbol of fear or otherness in horror. And generally it's a pretty common trope, whether it be the villain being portrayed as having some kind of physical difference, or that they're mentally different in that they're crazy or mad or insane. Or in fact, I was thinking about this the other day, having recently watched a slasher type movie. Usually when the numbers are whittled down, it tends to be that the characters are disabled in some way before they eventually end up dying, or there's some elements of torture within the kind of scenes of each of them kind of meeting their ends, depending on which type of horror that you're watching, I suppose. But how do you feel that horror games in particular portray characters with disabilities? Do you think that they challenge stereotypes, or do they actually end up just reinforcing them?
Yes, I mean, I do. I think they do end up reinforcing them, because I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because the thing that challenges society about disability is that it's different. It sets somebody aside. And I'm not in any way saying that's right or wrong. It's just, it is what it is. Somebody, it looks different or behaves differently or whatever. And I think that in our at a sort of very like base level, there's disquiet and discomfort around different. And I think that you can understand that from a sort of purely kind of animalistic base level. When I say understand, I don't mean justify, I mean understand. But I think our society has built an entire cultural attitude on top of that, which reinforces those negative responses. And I think that as a society, what we could have done is gone a very different way. And as we enabled people with disabilities to be very engaged, active members of society, that we should have changed our cultural attitudes to those disabilities. And I think, unfortunately, we haven't. We've gone the opposite direction. And I think that horror movies and games really picks up on that and really draws on that and uses that as a way to scare people. And it's a bit lazy, really. It's a little bit lazy because, you know, the real thing to be scared of is harm, you know, physical or emotional injury. And it doesn't matter if the person doing that to you is, you know, some kind of Greek Adonis or whether they're sort of the elephant man. I mean, those two, that's not the issue. That's not the thing. That's not the thing to be scared of. Yet it's really interesting that when we're looking for like a scary, to scare people, we say, look at this person who's different, who's strange and other. So
Indeed.
I hope that came across.
No, it did. No, I think, like you say, Jem, there is a lot of society, there's a lot of fear around disability because there's like a lack of awareness around disability, but also the idea that disability is a bad thing, which is something that hopefully we're trying to move away from, because it's not a bad thing. It's a very natural part of being human. Whether it's physical or mental disability or both. But I think that horror plays on those fears of and indeed the language around disability, some really outdated terms play on those fears as well. It's almost like that person is being trapped. So if you take the terms, they're not appropriate terms, I must add, but terms like wheelchair bound, as if they're trapped in the chair or confined, trapped inside it like a prison. Whereas the opposite is in fact true. A wheelchair is a tool for independence, and a tool that people use, hence the more appropriate term wheelchair user. Same with bedbound. It's slightly more different. But it's that feeling of being trapped and stuck is something that people are very afraid of, because in some ways, when you live with disability, it can be very limiting and very isolating. But not only that, it's also isolating socially. And there's a lot of tropes around, the lonely, isolated, othered person taking out their trauma on other people in a way that's very scary. And I think that has very often played in a lot of horror as well.
Yeah, because there's always going to be, suffering is always going to be an inevitable part of life, and the process of any kind of disability can almost always come along with some suffering. But then it should be the job of society to not add to that, to empathise with and make adjustments to it, rather than just putting it into a corner and going, "Oh, I'm glad I'm not wheelchair ridden." Being described as ridden something seems particularly egregious. And the reason I was looking around there, because I'm looking for a fucking pen or a pencil, because you can't see, is I've got fucking shit everywhere in here. That's okay. There was one thing I think about quite often is have either of you ever seen any of the images from the First World War of soldiers with horrible facial injuries?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're shocking images to see, and you just go, "That's not what this is. This is the face of war. This is the only images that should be shown of war, because this is the face of it. It's not Call of Duty. It's this." And back then, there was looking like that. There's a book called, I think it's called like the face sculptor or something, because there was this plastic surgeon who felt so bad for these people being shunned, who were wounded in battle and being treated like monsters, and he found old photos of them and created these stunning lifelike prosthetics for them. And that's part of the process of making someone, because what disability can do is it robs you of your sense of self. And so this is from my experience. it can very easily rip away your sense of self, and it makes it very, very hard for you to remember that, oh yeah, you're there, and then your disability and all the stuff is on top of you, rather than it's your disability and then that's you. And what this this doctor did was that first step of, one, it makes you feel like yourself again, making them feel like themselves, and then it's the society, because they wrote in the book that if someone's missing a leg, then they're a hero and everyone loves them and adores them. But if you're missing half your face, then people don't want you to be around children and they want you to hide away. And there's that perspective on disability of there's good, inspiring disabled, and then there's like bad, just want to be hidden away disabled.
But both are objectively bad. Are they not? If you're, because what's happening is it's taking away the human part of the person. It's either presenting them as this broken thing that's really scary and should be fixed or hidden away, or this super inspirational thing that only serves as an idea to help other people feel better about themselves. And there's no middle ground very often. One thing I was thinking about, actually, in terms of challenging stereotypes, if you think about it very deeply, I suppose, you could say that a lot of the characters where the mental illness is the scary part, because the villain in the piece is crazy and mad, and that's why they're killing people or whatever. You could think about it in terms of, like, society's attitude towards mental ill health is so very often stigmatizing and isolating that it could drive people to that. But then again, it's also playing into that stereotype that that's what will happen if you have a mental illness, that you'll just, everyone will be really scared of you. So I don't know, really. I'm kind of on the fence about it, because it's like, it's hard to explain.
It's just a cheap stereotype to go, oh, they're crazy. They're like the Arkham. It's
done so many times over, isn't it? You know.
I think the problem comes when they, like, someone tries to do it seriously, like in the Joker movie. So I walked out of, because it's just a utter bullshit watching. It's just a cartoon like impression of what mental illness is meant to be, and everyone going, oh, it's the most realistic, it's shining a new light on the complexity of mental illness. No, you're just making him a spectacle of going, oh, what long list of things can we give him that we can just have him be a crazy maniacal clown person. Whereas in, say, Senua's Sacrifice, that's an element of mental illness that is portrayed really well.
I was about to bring that up, actually, because that is one of the few games, I think we did discuss it previously as well, that does show psychosis in perhaps a more, or let's say a less stereotypical way than it might have been in a different type of game, for example. But yeah, I think it's that those kinds of games are quite few and far in between, I think, generally. And often
it's because it's hard.
It falls back on that lazy stereotype, doesn't it? But yeah.
Yeah, it's that there are, like you say, there's the inspiring disability, and then there's the everything else going, oh, it doesn't quite fit in
to the narrative,
so we'll ignore that.
Yeah.
And because some things they're just difficult and they're not very inspiring, but those are the ones that 99% of the people who experience them go through. And it's and
Yeah. It reminds me
comes down to
actually when we
stereotypes again.
started off these episodes telling our own spooky stories at the beginning, and the scariness that comes from something not quite fitting into what you expect. And I think that's definitely a theme that carries through, particularly in reference to disability within horror. When we think about society as a whole and what society values, that's obviously changed over the course of history. And now we're very much, as Matt will attest, and it has done many times, we're very about capitalism. So there's a lot of value placed on your ability to work and contribute to society. And if you can't do that for whatever reason, or that is not possible for you, depend on with different other factors, it could be a condition that you have, or it could be society's barriers placed upon you. But for whatever reason, you don't fit into that nice, neat box that society wants you to fit into, and therefore you are othered. And then there's this lack of awareness around it, and then this culture of fear grows because there's, we don't talk about it enough, and that's when stereotypes occur and people start saying things that are clearly based on stereotypes and not facts, and start making assumptions. But that's a wider symptomatic problem of ableism in society. But you can see where those strands lead to particular horror storylines, because it's something that doesn't fit into what is normal for society. And sometimes that can be quite scary. Yeah.
I think that we always come down to it, don't we? The games industry needs to take more responsibility for how it represents most things. As you said, Senua Hellblade is a really good example of the industry doing it right. But they brought in experts to advise on how to do that and what they so they took advice, just like we've talked about the importance of people taking advice around consent and all of that. So I think that there is definitely this aspect that it can be done right, and it can be done in an enjoyable gaming. It doesn't have to. You don't have to sacrifice the fun of the game to get it right. But what you do need to do is to consult some experts.
Definitely, Jan.
Which I think happens too rarely.
Indeed.
And you just made me go, well, as my initial, when Alex, you were saying about how the quote unquote able-bodied are going, I don't want to think about that, and all the just stick with the stereotypes and just going, they're a burden, they're an add-on who we tolerate as we move forward, and go, right, that makes the lives of disabled people worse because they're not being seen as they are, and they're the people who are in that position are the ones putting the barriers up for other people, but they're also putting barriers up for themselves because, as I've said before, I can't work an average 40-hour week job without becoming seriously ill and having to stop. And so someone looking at me and going and say, okay, just sit to the side and be useless. And then they'll be going, well, what other choice does he have? And they'll go, well, I have to work 60 hours a week. It's not fair that he doesn't have to. And then you go, well, stop. You have to work 60 hours a week. Why is that? And then you go, so that could be different. If in the journey we've been working right, how do we get disabled people into society in the best way that they're able to? Then that will teach the rest of them. Will go, I can actually do a similar thing for myself.
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have to do 60 hours a week. And if my boss goes, no, fuck you, you have to do 60 hours a week because of capitalism, then you can go, actually, I actually going to work with all the people I've been working with now, and we'll go, fuck you, I want to work less.
Exactly. There's a quote that I really love from a disability rights activist, Imani Barbarim, I think is her surname. She's based in America, and she's a black lady with cerebral palsy. And I think her handle is Crutches and Spice, if you're interested. I would recommend you give her a follow. But one of her best quotes is basically to non-disabled people. She says, the inaccessibility you ignore will become the inaccessibility you inherit when you inevitably become disabled. Sorry, I lost where I was going midway through. But yeah, it's a very powerful quote, really, because accessibility benefits everybody, as we've said many times on the pod. But yeah, so helping to make games more diverse in that way will also help telling better stories, just generally making better games and giving players more choice in what they choose to play as well, which, again, we've said it lots of times, but it's true. So it's a nice thing to think about. But speaking of race in particular, and
I just add one final thing to it, is that Jeremy, you're saying about Senua and bringing experts in things. Disability is very complicated, and complexity makes things more interesting.
It does.
So when you go, I'm going to take this disabled character and go, oh, they're crazy, and go from there, it could be really, it could turn out being something interesting, but most of the time it's not. It's just going to be another cartoony thing. But if you go, say, Psychosis, and go, that's complex, and then if you start from a place of complexity, then you're bound to make something more interesting. So it's the same with the able-bodied people and the game. A lot of game developers is going, you're not only making things worse for the people that you're like thinking about or ignoring or stereotyping, you're actually making things worse for yourself. You're making less good games. The games that you make, the characters that you make, will be less good because your thinking around it is wrong. And yeah, there's so much potential.
Indeed. Thank you for that. So when we think about another protected characteristic, as is from the Equality Act, race, and race in horror games, there are sometimes quite a lot of tropes that border on the problematic or offensive within horror games. So how do you think that horror games generally portray race? And are there examples that break away from any racial stereotypes that you can think of? So
I think this is really
it's a tricky one.
Actually.
There's things like
because
The Walking Dead, I remember, has a black protagonist.
Yes, it does, and that was the one that actually popped into my head. And I remember when I was playing it, it was because it's a rare thing, and the Walking Dead games are interesting because despite, I think if you haven't come across the Walking Dead games, you might assume that they're like first-person zombie shooter, but they're not. They're extremely involved and very emotional, choice-based story games, really, where your main thing is to, it's a choose your own adventure game, I suppose, is the best way to describe it. And the character in that is black. I don't think that the fact that he is black is relevant in the game. I think he just happens to be a black man, and that doesn't have a lot of relevance. But I'm feeling like there was some racism directed at him at some point in the early chapters.
It wouldn't surprise me
maybe
that would come up.
Yeah, because I think that's also an issue, isn't it? When games companies have a black character or a female character or a disabled character, and that characteristic doesn't have any impact on the character. And I think it's almost as problematic,
because it's not realistic,
as
is it? There's going to be an impact, because that's how life works.
Yeah, exactly. And when I grew up, everyone talked about being colourblind. That was such a trendy thing, and it's very much out of favour now, correctly. And it took me a long time, as somebody who'd grown up in that environment, where the idea was that, you know, we should just treat everybody the same no matter what. I think it's been a journey for me to understand why it matters, and to understand that, you know, equity is the important thing, and equity only comes from recognising the disadvantages or the discrimination or the challenges that somebody faces in our, you know, ableist, patriarchal, you know, white supremacist society that we live in. How anyone who doesn't fit those stated norms it is impacted, and I'm really struggle to think of games that actually explore any of those issues in any detail, really, let alone, you know, or rather that they don't even have characters with those characteristics.
It's hard to think of some, isn't it?
Generally.
But, yeah. I think another example might also be Resident Evil 5, which sparked controversy for its depiction of African villagers as enemies, reinforcing problematic racial stereotypes. And that comes up relatively commonly in older games, where you've got like native villagers as the enemies that you would have to either kill or who are like the scary enemies of a game.
Yeah, or more primitive, or less civilized, less morally, you know, all of those things are assigned to. It's such a colonial attitude, really, that isn't it?
Brings up really nicely. I think I mentioned it to you at the end of last week, a book that I've been reading about the history of the disabled mind from 1700 to the present day. And I have just read the chapter on race and disability and colonialism and that whole period. And it was so interesting because I hadn't really fully understood how much ideas of the idiot in society underpinned racism and colonialism and what drove colonialism to happen. Like, a lot of the travellers at the time who were colonialising these places had ideas of what an idiot was, and they started to kind of paint non-Europeans as idiot races. So whole races of idiots, because they didn't conform to more civilised European ways of doing things. They didn't understand property and how to own and run a property. And so their justification for colonising places was, oh, well, we'll come in and we'll run the land for you. We'll sort out your property for you. Because if you're living nomadically, that's clearly uncivilised and idiotic and not the right way to go about living your life. So we'll do it for you. And it underpins all of it. And it just absolutely, I definitely feel a lot more educated now having read that. Because it's just, you can't separate the two ideas. And I hadn't realised how much they blended together to that extent.
And I think one thing that's really interesting is that how much have things actually changed today, because we live in a society, especially in the UK, and I think we've exported a lot of this, but I think it is particularly problematic for the UK because we live in a very fundamental, we lived in a very strongly classist society. And my personal theory is that we have really embedded that in our psyche, in our group psyche, and we find it very difficult to push back against it. And we did a couple of episodes, didn't we, about sort of royalty and the landed gentry and all of those things, and how they're portrayed in games, and how attitudes to them in society impact how we relate to them in the games, and how often the hero is some lord or, you know, master in some way, and that there's this sort of attitudes that some people are just better than other people. And fundamentally, this is my educated opinion, but fundamentally this is underpinned by the refusal for so many of these people to recognise that they have what they have by chance, by luck, by virtue of who they were the family they were born into, or the country they were born to, or the abilities they were born with, you know. And they don't acknowledge that if somebody has a disability, if somebody has different colour skin, or comes from a family that, you know, has slavery in its history, that means that the person today in 2024 is potentially at a disadvantage as a result of all of that. And that they, in their, you know, well-off families with their big houses and their land, are there by virtue of a different set of circumstances. It is not that they are a better person. You know, Elon Musk, just to get on my soapbox, Elon Musk, who has just been given a job in the US government starting in January under Trump, may well have worked a bit hard to get where he got, may well be a little bit clever, but, you know, he is not cleverer than every single person on the planet. He is not where he is because he is better or because he deserves to be there. And I think that our inability to really recognise that our privilege means that we have these things, and to acknowledge that, and to say, you know, oh, I was lucky. The dice rolled in my favour. The effort that the people right at the top have gone to deliberately find reasons to justify why other people don't have the things that they value, money, property, you know, whatever. I think that's fundamentally part of that, because if you say that those people, they must be idiots, because if they weren't idiots, they would have what I have. So therefore, I'm better than them, and therefore it's okay that I have what I have and they don't have what I have, because I deserve it and they clearly don't, because if they did, they would have it. And then you export that around the world, and with your taking your crazy ideas of what is and isn't important, and say, you know, and walk into a village on, you know, the new Americas, and say, oh well, you know, you must be a complete idiot because you're not driving around in a carriage and, you know, living in a mansion. If you only need to take a small step back, and then you realise how crazy it is, and so we just see those colonial attitudes, those fundamental attitudes, which are, I'm increasingly convinced, simply an effort of the landed gentry to maintain
power
their
and control.
Yeah,
exactly.
And then you give Elon Musk a job in the government.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Gaming the System. If you want to support us, you can donate to us through our PayPal by sending it to wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com if you want to send us a one-off donation. If you want to donate to us monthly, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gamingthesystem. Until next time, bye-bye.